Can one step redraw the map of the world? Tonight, on the bank of a forbidden river, a man hesitates, then chooses the irreversible. The Rubicon runs cold as iron, torches spit and hiss, leather sandals grind on wet gravel, and Rome holds its breath. Let this calm tale of ambition and courage carry you to sleep. Settle in, breathe deeply, and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1. At the Gates of Destiny. Part 1. The Youth of a Patrician. Rome, the city of 7 hills, buzzed daily with ceaseless clamor. The clatter of sandals on cobblestones, the cries of merchants in the marketplace, the passionate declamations in the forum, and the trumpet blasts accompanying ceremonies. Amid marble and dust, splendor and misery, the Republic stood at the zenith of its power, yet its foundations were already trembling, and in this fragile world, destined for storms of ambition and rivalry, Caius Julius Caesar was born. Hailing from the ancient gens Julia, he bore a name heavy with history and myth. It was whispered that his lineage descended from Julius, son of Aeneas, himself son of Venus. In a Rome where the glory of ancestors weighed on every citizen, Caesar grew up with the sense that destiny had marked him with an invisible seal. His mother, Aurelia, an upright and austere woman, embodied the rigor and dignity of Roman traditions. His father, Caius Julius Caesar, a respected praetor, exemplified political authority. But it was from Aurelia that the young boy absorbed the inner discipline and sense of gravity that would become his most reliable weapons. Even as a child, Caesar observed Rome's spectacle with singular intensity. The narrow streets of the Subura, crowded with the poor, slaves, and foreigners, sparked deep curiosity in him. He loved to breathe in the scents of warm bread, oil, and sweat, mingled with the incense offered to the gods. And when he raised his eyes to the gleaming temples crowning the hills, he felt torn between 2 worlds, that of the noisy, vulnerable populace and that of the powerful, draped in their purple, masters of the Senate and the legions. His education was meticulous. He was taught to read poets and historians, the art of rhetoric, and the principles of law. Early on, Caesar understood that words could be sharper weapons than swords. It is said that, as a child, he would rehearse long imaginary speeches before a bronze mirror, modulating his voice, refining his gestures, adjusting his gaze until he achieved the desired effect. His teachers marveled at this passion, for most of his peers contented themselves with rote study. Caesar, however, sought to persuade and dominate through speech, as if he sensed that Rome's destiny would be decided as much in the forum as on the battlefield. But he was not merely an aspiring orator. Caesar also toughened himself in the military arts, training in the use of weapons and physical exercise. His physique, initially frail, gained vigor through discipline and effort. In the training fields, he revealed an instinctive tactical intelligence. Rather than relying on brute strength, he surprised his comrades with sudden ruses, unexpected maneuvers, as if he were already playing a game of chess on the sand. One evening, as the setting sun set the Tiber ablaze with golden glints, the adolescent Caesar accompanied his uncle to a religious ceremony. Torches cast tall flames, and priests examined the entrails of sacrificed animals. The air was thick with incense and murmurs, while augurs raised their eyes to the stars. Caesar, standing still, felt a strange vibration course through his being. As if the celestial vault were leaning toward him, he sensed an obscure promise. His destiny would be great, but fraught with trials. The memory of that night remained etched in his mind like an indelible mark. Caesar's adolescence was marked by the discovery of the political struggles shaking Rome. His aunt Julia was the wife of Marius, the great general and champion of the people, whose victories over the Cimbri and Teutons had earned him immense glory. But this glory had drawn the enmity of the Senate and, above all, of Sulla, the general of the Optimates. The young Caesar, still in the shadow of the great, already understood that the Republic was consuming itself in bloody rivalries. In the Forum, he once saw Cicero plead. The crowd held its breath, captivated by the eloquence of this slender man with a piercing gaze. Caesar stood transfixed, fascinated by this voice that seemed to chain hearts. Returning home, he declared to his mother, "Weapons subdue bodies, but words subdue souls." Aurelia merely placed a firm hand on his shoulder, but her silence was tantamount to agreement. He had grasped the truth. Yet ominous omens continued to haunt his mind. One night, he dreamed he walked on a path paved with white marble, lined with columns stretching to infinity. At the far end shone a laurel crown, but the closer he advanced, the more shadows tried to hinder his steps, like hands rising from the ground. Awakening with a start, he lay still in the darkness for a long time, aware that this dream carried a warning. Thus ended his youth, not as a peaceful phase, but as a preparation. Caesar was not yet the man who would overthrow the Republic, but his name already resonated like a promise. In the alleys of Rome and the marble of the temples, a murmur spread. A destiny was rising. Part 2. Rome in Flames. Rome was a hive of ambitions, and within its walls smoldered the embers of a political fire ready to erupt. The people crowded the Forum daily, eager for news, scrutinizing the faces of senators, counting the legions parading through the streets, and dividing themselves according to rumors. Two names dominated all conversations, that of Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, and that of Sulla, the general of the Optimates. Their rivalry was fought not only in speeches, but in blood and fear. Marius had built his glory on the battlefield. His military reforms had armed the people, integrating the poor into the legions, promising glory and pay to those who had nothing. To the Roman masses, he was a hero. To the conservative patricians, he was becoming a threat. Sulla, his former lieutenant, represented the Senate's order, the threatened aristocracy, the traditions of the ancients. Between them, conflict was inevitable. The young Caesar, still an adolescent, observed this titanic struggle from the walls of his family home. His mother, Aurelia, forbade him from speaking publicly on the matter, but he could see the silent anxiety in the eyes of his kin. By blood, Caesar belonged to Marius's camp. His aunt Julia was the general's wife. In a fracturing Rome, this heritage was both a burden and a blessing. One evening, as he crossed the Subura to return home, Caesar stopped before a crowd. Makeshift orators were haranguing the masses. One of them, brandished a torch and shouted, "Marius is Rome's savior. Without him the Cimbri would have ravaged our lands." And what does the Senate do? It schemes, it betrays, it sells the city to Sulla. The crowd roared in response, some hurling stones against the walls, others invoking the gods. Caesar, hidden in the shadows, felt a strange vibration stir within him. This tumult was not merely the anger of a people, it was the breath of a republic on the verge of suffocation. Soon after, civil war broke out. Sulla, proclaimed consul, was tasked with the war against Mithridates, king of Pontus. But Marius, humiliated, did everything to strip him of this command. The Senate, manipulated, wavered. Rome's streets became battlefields where the partisans of the two generals clashed with swords and torches. Flames rose in certain quarters, and the Forum, once a sanctuary of words, turned into a bloody arena. Caesar, still too young to fight, paced his family home like a caged beast. He saw messengers come and go, bringing dire news. Marius had been driven out, then recalled, then banished again. Sulla was returning with his legions, threatening to trample the city itself. Every knock at the door could herald a fatal destiny. One evening, Aurelia had him sit in the silent atrium. The flickering light of oil lamps cast grave shadows on her face. "Remember, Caius," she said in a low voice, "in these times of madness, the reckless burn like torches. You are tied by blood to Marius, and Sulla does not forget. But keep your mind intact, for storms pass, and only those who know how to wait stand tall after the tempest." Caesar nodded, but deep within, a fire was growing. He did not want merely to wait. He wanted to act. When Sulla entered Rome triumphantly, the young Caesar felt the vice tighten. The dictator launched a ruthless purge, the proscriptions. Each day lists of names were posted in the Forum. These names were not only those of enemies, but also of anyone whose wealth aroused greed. The condemned lost their possessions, their lives, and their memory. It is said that some, terrified, threw themselves toward death to spare their families. Caesar, by his blood, was in the crosshairs. He had married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, Marius's ally. Sulla demanded that he divorce her as a sign of allegiance to his power. Caesar refused. It was an insane act for a young man without an army or fortune facing the most powerful dictator in Rome. But this refusal was his first act of defiance. It is said that Sulla, irritated, declared to his circle, "In this boy there is more than one Marius. If you do not strike him down now, he will one day be the scourge of the Republic." This phrase, passed from mouth to mouth, became a prophecy, and Caesar, though hunted, was almost galvanized by it. Forced into exile, he wandered the countryside, evading assassins and bounty hunters. He changed refuges constantly, sometimes sleeping under the stars, sometimes in the barns of sympathetic peasants. His noble garments wore thin, his sandals frayed on dusty roads. But in this forced deprivation, he forged himself. Each day of uncertainty sharpened his endurance. Each danger faced strengthened his will. One winter evening, huddled by a makeshift fire, Caesar raised his eyes to the constellations. The cold bit at his fingers, but his mind burned. He made himself a promise. If he survived this relentless hunt, he would return to Rome not as prey, but as a master. And indeed, time turned. Sulla, burdened by illness and weary of power, retired. The Republic, trembling, breathed again. Caesar returned to Rome, wary but determined. He had lost his innocence, but gained a keen awareness of what politics was. A battlefield where life and death hung on the decisions of a single man. In streets still scarred by flames and blood, he walked with a firm step. Some remembered the hunted young patrician, others saw only a survivor. But already, in his gaze, burned a resolve that would not waver. Rome had been set ablaze, and Caesar had passed through the flames without being reduced to ashes. Part 3. Exile and Return. The wind of exile had swept over Caesar like a blade. After refusing to divorce Cornelia, Cinna's daughter, Sulla had sworn his destruction. At night, Caesar heard the footsteps of assassins prowling Rome's streets, knocking on doors, dragging the proscribed to their end. He had to flee, abandoning the familiar mosaics of his home for the uncertain paths of the countryside. A patrician, forced to hide like an outlaw, he discovered in this ordeal a truth. Storms forge men more surely than banquets or the lessons of masters. He found refuge first in the hills of Latium, then farther afield, where Sulla's legions did not cast their gaze. Sometimes he disguised himself, clad in a simple coarse tunic, his feet dusty like a shepherd's. The nobility of his bearing betrayed his origins, but his endurance saved him. He learned to sleep under trees, to listen to nocturnal sounds, the hoot of an owl, distant barking, the crack of a branch broken by an animal. Every sound, once insignificant, became a signal for survival. One evening, as he crossed a deserted valley, men emerged from the shadows. Armed with daggers, they demanded his purse. Caesar, though unarmed, did not yield to panic. In a calm but firm tone, he declared, "You may take my possessions, but know that you cross a man who, one day, will command more legions than you can imagine. Choose, then, whether you wish to be my enemies today or my allies tomorrow." The bandits, disconcerted by this assurance in a fugitive, backed away. Caesar continued on his way, leaving behind men troubled, almost convinced they had seen a living prophecy walk past. Gradually, he reached the shores of the Mediterranean. Sulla, undermined by illness, was slowly loosening his grip, and the wind of dictatorship weakened. Caesar, however, did not return immediately. He journeyed to the east, where Rome extended its frontiers like tentacles. There began his first military experiences. In Asia, he joined Roman troops sent against the armies of Mithridates, king of Pontus, a formidable enemy who resisted the Republic with tenacity. Caesar was then just a young man without command, but his bravery soon made him a topic of conversation. During a siege, when legionaries hesitated to scale the enemy walls, he was among the first to rush forward, shield raised, shouting for others to follow. The sun burned his shoulders, stones rolled under his sandals, but his momentum inspired his comrades. The position was taken, and Caesar, covered in dust and sweat, gained what he desired most, a reputation. After the battle, some veterans looked at him with curiosity. "That boy from the Julia clan, he's got fire in his blood. No wonder they say he descends from Venus." Caesar, hearing these words, smiled inwardly. Glory, even modest, was already adding to his name. His years of wandering also brought a subtler education, the diplomacy of military camps, the art of speaking to soldiers of winning their loyalty. He knew how to listen to their tales, share their wine, laugh at their jests, without losing his natural authority. This blend of humanity and grandeur would become one of his greatest assets. One day, the legions would follow Caesar, not only out of duty, but out of devotion. But fortune, ever capricious, spared him no further trials. On the coasts of Asia Minor, while traveling by sea, his ship was intercepted by Cilician pirates. They captured him and demanded a ransom. Caesar, instead of lamenting, burst into laughter. When the bandits announced the price for his release, he protested, "You don't know who I am. 20 talents of silver? That's an insult. Demand 50, and you'll be more credible." The pirates, amused by this arrogance, doubled the ransom. During the weeks of captivity, Caesar never behaved like a prisoner. He mingled in their games, recited poems, corrected their speeches, and sometimes admonished them. "When I'm free, I'll have you all crucified." They roared with laughter, thinking it a jest, but Caesar spoke with the certainty of a prophet. Once freed, thanks to the ransom paid by his kin, he immediately organized a small fleet, pursued his captors, captured them, and, true to his word, had them crucified. This episode, recounted from tavern to tavern, added an unsettling aura to his name. Caesar was not only brave, he was relentless, and his word was as good as an oath. When news of Sulla's death finally reached him, Caesar knew the time for return had come. The Republic, still trembling, sought new faces. He, who had survived the proscriptions, fought in Asia and defied pirates, returned with experience forged in iron and blood. The journey back to Rome was an inner crossing for him. Gazing at the Mediterranean waves, he recalled his exile, his freezing nights, his frantic flights through the hills. He measured the path he had traveled. When he left, he was but a threatened young patrician. Upon his return, he was a man hardened by storms, tested by the gods without being broken. When he set foot again on Rome's cobblestones, he walked with a firm step. The street still buzzed with the memory of violence, but for him, every stone, every column, every statue seemed to welcome him like a prodigal son. His friends and enemies watched him closely. Some whispered, "There's the one Sulla already feared." Others sneered, thinking him too ambitious for his age, but in his gaze shone a resolve no one could ignore. Caesar had tasted exile and return. He had seen the fragility of life and the power of destiny. Henceforth, he would no longer be content to survive. He wanted to conquer. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Popular. Part 1. The Captive of the Pirates. The Aegean Sea stretched before him like a mirror of azure, stirred by gentle waves gilded with shifting reflections by the sun. Caesar, still young, was crossing these waters on a merchant ship, heading to Rhodes to perfect his oratory skills under Greek masters. His reputation was beginning to grow in Roman circles, but he knew that to dominate the forum, he needed to sharpen his voice and gestures at the school of rhetoricians. Yet destiny, ever unpredictable, had an ordeal in store that would seal his nascent legend. As his ship sailed off the coast of Asia Minor, dark sails appeared on the horizon. They were Cilician pirates, feared throughout the Mediterranean. Armed to the teeth, their swift ships swooped down on the Roman vessel. The passengers offered little resistance. The assailants were too numerous, too ferocious. Caesar was captured, along with a few companions, and taken to the island where the bandits held their lair. There, they demanded a ransom. The pirate chief, a bearded man with a brutal gaze, announced in a hoarse voice, "We demand 20 talents of silver for your freedom." Caesar burst into clear laughter, resonating like a slap in the silence of the camp. 20 talents? You don't know who you've captured. Demand 50, and you'll be closer to my worth. The pirates, stunned, exchanged glances. Was this reckless arrogance, or the assurance of a truly powerful man? In the end, amused by this insolence, they doubled the ransom. Thus began the most singular episode of Caesar's youth. A prisoner, he never acted like one. In the wooden enclosure where he was held, he moved freely, conversing with his captors as if he were their leader. He recited poems to them, improvised speeches, criticized their crude style, corrected them like a stern master scolding clumsy students. Sometimes he played dice with them, and when he lost, he would erupt with such authority that the pirates almost felt guilty for defeating him. But even stranger, he did not hide his intentions. Often, with an enigmatic smile, he told them, "When I'm free, I'll return with ships, and I'll have you all crucified." The bandits roared with laughter, slapping their calloused thighs. To them, these threats were mere jest. How could this young patrician without an army or fortune accomplish such vengeance? But Caesar was not joking. Every word he spoke carried the weight of an oath. For 40 days he lived among them, turning his captivity into a theater stage. His companions, initially anxious, eventually caught his confidence. Even the pirates seemed to admire him despite themselves. Their laughter, their drunken revelry, their games took on a different hue in his presence. It was as if Caesar dominated them not by force, but by the sheer power of his spirit. Finally, the ransom was gathered and paid. Freed, Caesar left the island with a handful of men. But no sooner had he touched solid ground than he set about fulfilling his promise. He recruited a few ships from Rome's allies, gathered volunteers, and set sail for the pirates' lair. The attack was lightning fast. Caught off guard by the audacity of the man they thought incapable of revenge, the bandits were swiftly defeated. Caesar captured them all, including their chief, and brought them to the coast. There, true to his word, he ordered their crucifixion. But it is said, in a gesture of clemency, he had their throats cut before they were hung on the crosses, sparing them prolonged agony. This act, both merciless and tempered with a hint of mercy, already reflected the complexity of his character. Caesar was not a blind executioner. He was a man of principles, but principles forged by the relentless logic of power. This episode spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean. The tale was told of the young Roman who laughed at his captors, humiliated them, then annihilated them. Veterans, merchants, and travelers spoke his name with admiration or fear. It was not merely an anecdote, it was a prophecy in motion. The man who treated his captors like children and turned weakness into victory already heralded the future master of Rome. When Caesar resumed his journey to Rhodes, he was no longer the same man. His captivity had bolstered his confidence, his taste for challenge, and his conviction that nothing was impossible for him. In Rhodes, he continued his studies in eloquence, listening to the great Greek masters, but his mind no longer settled for the subtleties of rhetoric. Every argument, every cadence of phrase, every studied gesture was merely a weapon added to his arsenal. He knew that words were invisible swords, capable of conquering more surely than legions. Upon his return to Rome, this reputation preceded him like an aura. In the port taverns, he was pointed out as the one who had crucified the pirates. In the alleys of the Subura, it was whispered that the blood of bandits still clung to his name. In aristocratic circles, some smiled at his audacity, others trembled at his ambition. In the Forum, Caesar took his first steps as an orator. His deep and clear voice, his regal bearing, his ability to inflame crowds struck all who heard him. He did not merely plead causes, he mesmerized his listeners. It is said that during his first speeches, passers-by stopped, captivated, forgetting their errands to listen to this young man whose words seemed charged with divine fire. He was still far from power, but already he advanced with an assurance that unsettled his contemporaries. He had known exile, war, captivity, and emerged greater for it. Rome, fragile and divided, sought men capable of embodying its destiny. Caesar, slowly but surely, was preparing for it. In his heart, a certainty burned. The world was not a trap to hold him, but a stage for his triumph. Part 2. The Art of Words and Games. The Roman Forum awoke like a stone theater. Amid slender columns and statues of glorious ancestors, the crowd began to gather. Merchants shouted, scribes scratched tablets, senators in white togas advanced with solemn steps. In this tumult, one silhouette stood out by the vivacity of his gaze and the firmness of his stride. Caius Julius Caesar. He was still a young man, without a major magistracy, without command of an army, but he carried within him something singular that all felt but could not name. Some whispered that his lineage, tied to Venus through the legend of the Julii, lent him an almost divine aura. Others saw only arrogance. But when Caesar spoke, even his fiercest enemies inwardly bowed to the power of his voice. Caesar had understood that in Rome, war was waged first with words. Swords decided battles, but the Republic was decided in the Forum, in the courts, in the assemblies. He spent entire nights honing his eloquence, rehearsing speeches before bronze mirrors, measuring his gestures, adjusting his silences. When he first spoke in a public case, many expected a mere schoolboy exercise, but his voice, deep and supple, unfurled like a contained river. He did not thunder. He captured attention with initial gentleness, then tightened his grip on his audience like a net closing on fish. His Latin, nourished by Greek cadences, sounded both familiar and new. One day he accused a former governor of plundering and cruelty in the provinces. The judges, initially distracted, sat up. Caesar spoke of burned villages, ruined families, children sold as slaves. His arm rose at times, as if calling the gods themselves to witness. When he concluded by declaring that Rome must rule the world not only by force but by justice, the crowd erupted in applause. The accused was convicted. But more than the verdict, it was Caesar's name that everyone carried away that day in their memory. Yet Caesar knew that governing did not end in the courts. Rome was a city greedy for spectacles. The citizens, weary of famines and quarrels, wanted festivals to forget their miseries. As a deal, he understood the stakes. Games, public banquets, city decorations were political weapons. He launched lavish expenditures, funded by colossal loans. It was said he was drowning in debt, but he smiled at those who worried. Debts were nothing, he said, as long as they bought the future. In the streets, he had new statues erected, restored crumbling temples, cleaned alleys. The inhabitants of the Suburra, accustomed to foul odors and menacing shadows, suddenly saw their quarters lit with hanging lamps, their fountains repaired, their squares alive with musicians. Then came the games. Under a sky draped with colored awnings, the circus stands filled with tens of thousands of spectators. Trumpets sounded, gladiators entered the arena, beasts roared behind bars. Caesar, seated in his Aedila's chair, watched the crowd. The shouts, cheers, shivers of fear or ecstasy were threads he pulled to weave his popularity. Every beast released, every combat, every spectacular triumph became a memory the people associated with his name. The optimates in the Senate criticized him vehemently. He squanders public funds. He corrupts citizens with unworthy feasts. But in the taverns, markets, and fields, people repeated, "Caesar thinks of us. Caesar gives us games. Caesar lights up our nights." In a republic where prestige mattered more than gold, this recognition was worth entire armies. To finance his prodigality, Caesar needed solid support. That's when he approached Crassus, the richest man in Rome, capable of buying entire districts in a single day. Their pact was sealed discreetly. Crassus would provide the money, and Caesar, in return, would offer political support to bolster his business and influence. It was a marriage of convenience, but Caesar, with his charm, also knew how to flatter the magnate's pride. Pompey, meanwhile, returned crowned with victories in the east. The Senate received him coldly, but the people acclaimed him. Caesar, astute, already envisioned uniting these rival forces, the wealth of Crassus, Pompey's military prestige, and his own growing popularity, into a single bundle of power. The idea of the triumvirate, still vague, took root. But Caesar did not content himself with entertaining the people. He knew how to revive memories to turn them into political weapons. During his Aunt Julia's funeral, Marius's widow, he had the general's trophies displayed. Veterans wept, women raised their arms to the sky, and even those who feared Marius's memory felt gripped. The Senate shuddered. This was a direct challenge to those who had sought to erase the popular hero's name. Caesar, in a calm but vibrant voice, evoked the glory of past victories, the legions that had saved Rome from barbarians. In celebrating Marius, he linked his own name to the former champion of the people. That day, he did not merely deliver a eulogy, he sealed a pact with collective memory. Not everyone was fooled. Cato, the inflexible defender of the traditional republic, watched Caesar with acute suspicion. To him, these lavish expenditures were corruption, these games a dangerous seduction, these speeches a threat to liberty. In Senate debates, he fiercely opposed Caesar, calling him a demagogue. But Caesar, cunning, never lost his temper. He responded calmly, sometimes with an ironic smile, as if he already saw beyond his adversaries. His consecration came with his election as Pontifex Maximus. His rivals, older and wealthier, thought they would crush him. But Caesar had learned to wield votes as one wields cohorts. In the assemblies, he won massive popular support. When the results were proclaimed, naming him Pontifex Maximus, the skeptics stood petrified. Caesar, barely in his 30s, now held Rome's highest religious office. To the people, it was a sign from the gods. To his enemies, a warning. To Caesar, another step on the ladder of power. That evening, he returned home. Aurelia, his mother, awaited him in the atrium. She embraced him without fanfare, but her eyes shone with restrained pride. Later, alone under the stars, Caesar looked up at the Roman sky. The constellations seemed to align, tracing a path. He understood that he was no longer just a talented advocate or a lavish aedile. He was a public figure, a name etched in the people's hearts, a growing shadow in the Senate's mind. And in the silence of the night, he thought that Rome already belonged to him. Just a little. Part 3. The Pact of Giants. Rome's streets buzzed with rumors. In the taverns of the Subura and the villas of the Palatine, citizens spoke of the same names: Crassus, Pompey, Caesar, 3 stars whose orbits had seemed separate until now, but which destiny was about to align. The Republic, exhausted by quarrels and wars, resembled a colossus with legs of sand. Factions tore each other apart. The Senate wavered, and the people, tired of waiting for reforms, turned to men who could offer security and bread. Caesar, returning from his roles as aedile and Pontifex Maximus, covered in glory and debts, understood better than anyone that the time for solitary ambitions was over. To climb the next step, he needed to unite forces that seemed irreconcilable. He observed the cracked marble of the Republic like a strategist surveying a battlefield. Every flaw was an opportunity, every rival a piece he could move. Marcus Licinius Crassus first weighed on the city like a mountain of gold. His wealth seemed inexhaustible, and none could dispute his financial influence. Yet he remained frustrated. He bought votes, lands, magistracies, but his name inspired neither love nor glory. Caesar, buried in debt after his lavish spending, found him one evening in a Palatine garden. Torches cast trembling light on the cypresses, and the 2 men sized each other up like opponents before a duel. "You need my gold," Crassus said curtly, "and you need my popularity," Caesar replied bluntly. Silence stretched, broken by the trickle of a fountain. Crassus gave a bitter smile as if recognizing in this young man one of the few who could speak to him without fear. The deal was struck, simple but formidable. Gold would erase debts, gold would open doors, and in return, Caesar would carry Crassus in public decisions, lending legitimacy to his fortune. But another force dominated Rome: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Crowned with victories in the east, celebrated as a new Alexander, he had defeated Mithridates, subdued Syria, tamed Judea. His triumphs dazzled the people, but the Senate, jealous, refused to ratify some of his decisions, humiliating his veterans by denying them promised lands. Behind his conqueror's mask, Pompey seethed with frustration. Caesar chose his words carefully when he met him. In a villa far from the city's clamor, he spoke of glory and recognition. "Your victories belong to the world," he said, "but Rome keeps them in shadow. Join me, and together we will force the Senate to yield." Pompey, initially distant, sensed the truth in these words. His soldiers demanded justice, and Caesar offered the key to popular support he could not gain alone. The challenge remained to unite Crassus's gold and Pompey's legions. Two rivals divided by everything. One scorned military glory, the other envied vast riches. Caesar, with the patience of a spider, wove the threads of their alliance. One night, in a discreet residence, the three men met. No senators, no scribes, only three ambitious men speaking in low voices. Wine flowed, lamps cast a warm glow, and the air carried the weight of a historic moment. Caesar placed his hands on the table. His voice, deep and measured, resonated with the calm of a man who knows the value of each word. Crassus, your gold can buy armies, but it cannot buy hearts. Pompey, your victories dazzle, but they will remain barren without Senate support. I have neither immense treasures nor invincible legions, but I have the people. What I propose is unity. Let us combine our strengths, and Rome will bend before us. A heavy silence fell. The flames flickered. Crassus furrowed his brow. Pompey tapped the table with his finger. Finally, a faint smile crossed the general's lips. Crassus, after a moment, nodded. The pact was sealed. Thus was born in secrecy what history would call the first triumvirate. By torchlight, three men united their destinies. Crassus would bring gold, Pompey his armies, Caesar the fervor of the people. Three forces, once scattered, now fused in a formidable alliance. Nothing seemed to change immediately. The next day, Rome awoke to its usual clamor. Children ran through alleys, merchants shouted their prices, senators bickered in the forum. But in the shadows, a new authority had been born. The Republic, already ailing, did not know it had just signed its death warrant. Leaving the residence that night, Caesar walked alone through silent streets. The moon lit the cobblestones, and the statues of gods seemed to follow him with their stone gazes. He looked up at the sky. The stars, as if arranged by an invisible hand, seemed to trace a path. A shiver ran down his spine. What he had just accomplished was not merely a political maneuver. It was the opening of an irreversible destiny. He thought of the omens of his childhood, the dreams where shadows tried to hold him back, the voice he thought he heard under Mars's gaze. It all made sense now. Henceforth, the future belonged to him. Gold, legions, the people. Three weapons he had managed to unite under his name. And in the silence of the night, Caesar smiled as if he already saw, beyond Rome's hills, the endless plains he was about to conquer. Chapter 3. The Master of Gaul. Part 1. The Legions of the North. The northern wind swept across the plains of Cisalpine Gaul, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and deep forests. Caesar, now proconsul, advanced at the head of his troops along the paved road, stretching like a stone ribbon toward still untamed territories. The hills loomed on the horizon, shrouded in thick mists, and every breath of air seemed to whisper omens. The Senate, wary of his popularity, had entrusted him with these distant provinces, perhaps hoping to keep him far from Rome. But Caesar saw in this mission not exile, but a promise. Here, in the north, he could forge a glory surpassing that of all his rivals. His legions marched with him, disciplined, their helmets gleaming under the pale light. The sound of iron-shod sandals pounded the road with a rhythm like a beating heart. Each soldier carried a heavy load, sword, javelin, rectangular shield, provisions for days. Caesar often walked beside them, refusing the privileges of distant command. His presence, his deep voice, his attentive gaze bound the men to him with a loyalty that grew daily. In camp, as evening fell, he mingled with the centurions, listening to their tales of marches, sharing a simple meal by the fire. The flames danced on his face, and the soldiers whispered among themselves, "Our general lives like us." This proximity did not diminish his authority. On the contrary, it strengthened it. They knew he could demand the impossible, for he himself faced fatigue and cold without complaint. The Gallic tribes at the edges of his command were restless. Some, long under Roman influence, paid tribute and provided hostages. Others, proud and unsubmissive, awaited only an opportunity to rebel. Caesar observed these signs with a strategist's eye. Every alliance was a balancing act, every rebellion an opportunity. He knew history was forged in these shifting fringes where peoples wavered between submission and defiance. One day, messengers announced that a coalition of tribes threatened Rome's allies in Transalpine Gaul. Without waiting for Senate orders, Caesar rallied his legions. Under pouring rain, he addressed his soldiers. His voice, though covered by the sky's rumble, carried clearly. "Soldiers, now is the hour to prove to these peoples that Rome does not entrust its borders to weak hands. You are the living wall that protects the city. March with me, and you will see that no enemy can withstand men of iron." A powerful, unanimous shout rose. Roman standards were raised in the storm, and the cohort surged northward. The first clash occurred in a plain bordered by woods. The Gauls, countless, struck their shields with swords, their long hair flowing in the rain, their war paint streaking their faces. Their wild cries echoed like thunder. The legionaries, silent, tightened their ranks behind their shields. The contrast was striking. On one side, untamed fury. On the other, relentless order. Caesar positioned himself behind the front line, his soaked cloak clinging to his armor. His gaze swept the battlefield like an eagle scanning a valley. He raised his arm. A signal. Trumpets blared and the Roman wall advanced with slow, irresistible steps. Javelins were launched, falling like a rain of iron on the Gallic ranks. Enemy shields shattered, warriors fell. Then, at the centurion's sharp command, Roman swords flashed, short and precise, striking relentlessly. The battle was brief but bloody. Unable to breach the legion's discipline, the Gauls retreated bit by bit. Caesar, always close to his men, encouraged them with a firm voice, calling each by name when possible. This attention sparked new fervor. The soldiers felt their general saw them, recognized them. The victory was total, and the terrified Gallic survivors submitted. That evening, in a hastily erected camp, the soldiers celebrated their triumph. Fires blazed everywhere, songs rose into the night, and wine passed from hand to hand. Caesar, seated on a simple chair, observed the scene. He did not smile, for his mind was already elsewhere. This victory was but a prelude. Beyond the hills, he knew other peoples were gathering, stronger chiefs raising their swords. But he also knew each success strengthened his name. Each triumph, etched in his legion's memory, brought him closer to imperishable glory. At night, he left the clamor to walk alone under the stars. The northern sky seemed different from Rome's, vaster, wilder. The constellations shone with cold brilliance, as if the gods themselves were testing him. Caesar recalled his adolescent dreams, visions of a marble-paved road where shadows tried to hold him back. He understood he was now truly walking that road, and each victory was another column raised on his path. In the morning, scouts reported new tribes rising. Caesar showed neither surprise nor concern. He merely replied in a calm voice, "Then we will go further." His officers, struck by his quiet determination, exchanged glances. In their eyes shone both exhaustion and admiration. They knew they followed a leader who would never retreat. Thus began the northern campaigns, where Caesar would forge his military genius and destiny. The legions under his command would soon plunge into deep forests, cross tumultuous rivers, face countless enemies. But already, in the rain-soaked plain where they had crushed their first foes, Rome understood its general was no ordinary man. He marched toward a glory none could now wrest from him. Part 2. Vercingetorix and Alesia. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul had ignited Rome's imagination. Each victory brought him glory and wealth, but also the growing shadow of fear. Senators, alarmed, saw in him a man who would not settle for military triumphs. He returned laden with prestige, capable of shattering their fragile balances. But in the plains and forests of the north, the hour was not yet for Roman politics. There, among the Gallic tribes, a name was whispered as a promise of resistance: Vercingetorix. Son of the Arverni, a young chief with long fiery hair, he carried in his eyes the determination of a people refusing servitude. Where many tribes had submitted or divided, he united. His fiery words galvanized warriors. It was said he could speak to his men through entire nights, convincing them to burn their own fields, to starve the Romans, to destroy their villages rather than yield them to the enemy. His genius lay not in pitched battles, but in a war of attrition, where every tree, hill, and burned hearth became a weapon against the invader. When Caesar heard his name, he instantly knew he had found a worthy adversary. The echo of this singular chief swept through the valleys like a mighty wind. Caesar observed with cold admiration his enemy's method. Wherever he passed, the land emptied, granaries burned, herds vanished. The legions, deprived of supplies, had to draw on reserves and march ever farther, harassed by constant skirmishes. One evening, as the Roman camp settled at the foot of a wooded hill, Caesar gazed at the fire crackling before his tent. His officers surrounded him, worried. "They burn everything," one said. "There'll be nothing left for our men." Caesar raised his eyes. The flame reflected in his gaze like an omen. "Then we'll seek elsewhere. They think to exhaust us. They'll learn that discipline is stronger than hunger." The following days were a march of iron. The legions pressed through devastated lands, enduring fatigue, cold, and scarcity. But Caesar kept watch. Each morning he inspected the ranks, encouraged with a brief word, promised dazzling victories. In his wake, the legionaries' endurance became superhuman. They knew they followed a man who never yielded, and their faith compensated for lacking provisions. The decisive confrontation came at Alesia, There, Vercingetorix had gathered his forces, entrenched on a fortified hill surrounded by ditches and ramparts. His warriors, countless, followed him with fervor. Behind his walls of wood and earth, the Arverni chief defied all of Rome. Caesar, observing this natural fortress, felt the magnitude of the challenge, but he did not consider retreat. Instead of a frontal assault, he had colossal fortifications built around the city, ditches, stakes, palisades. Then, around this first circle, he erected another, meant to contain Gallic reinforcements. Thus, Alesia was trapped in a prison of earth and wood, encircled by an army preparing to withstand an external assault. Never had Rome seen so audacious a siege. Days stretched on, punctuated by the sound of shovels and hammers. Earth piled into ramparts. Towers rose, sharpened stakes bristled across the landscape. Sweat streamed down brows, arms broke under the labor, but Caesar was everywhere, inspecting, correcting, encouraging. His soldiers admired him for being ever present day and night, tending to every detail. Inside Alesia, famine took hold. Vercingetorix, from his ramparts, watched the Roman works. His jaw clenched, but he did not despair. He had sent messengers calling all tribes to aid. Soon, a tide of Gallic warriors arrived to break the encirclement. Then began the ultimate trial. Caught between the besieged attempting desperate sorties and the reinforcements attacking from outside, the Romans found themselves surrounded in turn. The Gauls' cries, their horns roaring like beasts, filled the valleys. Dust and smoke darkened the sky. Caesar, on horseback, rode along the lines, his red cloak billowing behind him. The exhausted soldiers looked to him and found courage anew. His voice rose above the tumult. "Remember, legionaries, that Rome watches. If we yield today, it's not a battle we lose, but the entire empire." A cry answered, powerful as thunder, and the Roman ranks held. The battle raged for hours. Between assaults and counterattacks, the Gallic reinforcements launched wave after wave, but Caesar's meticulously designed fortifications repelled them. The besieged sorties failed, broken by the cohort's discipline. Finally, as the sun sank, the relief army retreated, exhausted, scattered. The warriors, overwhelmed, fled across the plains. In Alesia, hunger and the certainty of defeat crushed the besieged's courage. Vercingetorix, understanding the fight was lost, made a decision that would mark the centuries. Mounted on his horse, draped in a resplendent cloak, he rode alone out of the fortress and descended to the Roman camp. There, before Caesar's tent, he dismounted, removed his sword, and laid it at the general's feet. A solemn silence fell. Caesar, motionless, looked at him long. In this gesture mingled grandeur and tragedy. Vercingetorix had just offered his enemy not only his own life, but the honor of all Gaul. Rome triumphed, and Caesar had achieved one of the greatest victories of his time. In the following days, the surviving Gauls were enslaved or massacred, as necessity demanded, but in Caesar's heart, this triumph resonated as a confirmation. His strategy, audacity, and discipline had prevailed where so many would have failed. In Rome, the news struck like thunder. Some already hailed Caesar as the greatest general of his century. Others in the Senate trembled. A man who could subdue all of Gaul could also subdue the Republic. That evening, alone in his tent, Caesar looked at his cloak, stained with dust and blood. The victorious legionaries' songs echoed in the distance. He raised his eyes to the lamp's flame and murmured, "Rome is at my feet." But in the shadows perhaps the gods fell silent, as if they knew this victory was but another step toward a yet more tragic destiny. Part 3. The Return of the Conqueror. Gaul had bowed. Its plains, forests, and hilltop villages had been subdued one by one. The names of Gergovia, Alesia, the crossed rivers, and the won battles now resonated like stones added to the growing monument of Caesar's glory. Behind him, the battle-hardened, victorious legions followed with almost religious fervor. Every soldier knew he had shared in an epic that would mark the centuries. And Caesar, at the pinnacle of his military triumph, was already thinking of return. Rome awaited him. Messengers had preceded his cohorts, announcing the submission of Gaul, the immense tribute, the thousands of prisoners, the seized riches. In the alleys of the Subura, in the taverns along the Tiber, in the villas of the Palatine, his name was spoken with admiration or fear. To the people, he was the protector, the invincible general who had extended the Republic's borders to the edges of the known world. To his enemies in the Senate, he was a threat too radiant, a man whose glory exceeded the limits tolerable for a mere citizen. When Caesar crossed the Alps and entered Italy, a rumor rose like a storm wind. The cohorts marched in order, their standards gleaming in the sun. Children ran along the roads to catch a glimpse. Peasants bowed. Elders raised their hands to the gods. It was whispered that Rome had not known so victorious a general since Alexander the Great. The soldiers' chants punctuated the march, sometimes crude, mocking, but always glorifying their leader. And Caesar smiled, for he knew this familiarity was a sign of absolute loyalty. At Rome's gates, a crucial question arose. Would he return as a simple citizen, laying down his command as the law required, or would he enter with his legions, defying the Republic? Caesar knew the trap. His enemies awaited, ready to accuse, diminish, or destroy him the moment he was unprotected. But he, prudent, delayed his decision. He camped outside the walls, observing the city like a beast sizing up its prey before the final leap. The people, however, would not wait. When news of his presence spread, crowds flocked. They shouted his name, reached out to him, demanded to see their hero's face. The markets buzzed with his image. Artisans paused their work to recount tales of battles. Elders relayed the legionaries' words. Caesar calls us by our names. Caesar marches with us. Caesar shares our hardships. In these stories, he appeared not only as a general, but as a father, a guide, a demigod. One day, in the Forum, an orator cried out, "Rome is great by its walls and laws, but Caesar has made it immense by his victories." The crowd erupted in cheers, and the senators present exchanged anxious glances. Each popular shout was a stone removed from the foundations of their power. Caesar, in the privacy of his home, reflected on this tumult. He knew his glory was both his weapon and his danger. His former allies were becoming rivals. Pompey, once his partner in the secret pact, was drifting away, jealous of his fame and drawn to the Senate's camp. Crassus was gone, fallen in the east against the Parthians, taking with him the fragile balance of the triumvirate. Now, two giants faced each other, Pompey and Caesar. One night, Caesar walked alone through Rome's streets. The moon, bathed the temples in silvery light. The statues seemed to breathe in the shadows. He walked to the deserted forum. The towering columns stood against the night sky. He placed his hand on a cold stone and murmured, "All this is already mine." The words faded into the silence, but he felt deep within that he was not wrong. Yet omens multiplied. Priests reported seeing flames dancing on the northern hills. Crows, in broad daylight, circled above the Capitoline. Soothsayers whispered that the gods were divided, some favorable, others hostile. Caesar listened without flinching. Since childhood, he had learned to see signs as echoes of destiny, never as chains. In the Senate, his enemies stirred. Cato, the staunch defender of the Republic, called for caution and resistance. Others, more cunning, sought to trap Caesar with decrees that would force him to relinquish his command before seeking the consulship. They wanted to strip him of his legal armor to deliver him naked to their accusations. But Caesar, like a chess player, saw their moves coming. Meanwhile, his legions camped near the city, impatient, loyal, ready to answer his signal. Discipline remained strict, but all knew the hour was near. Around the fires, soldiers spoke of Rome, of the triumphs awaiting, of promised rewards. Some dreamed of lands, others of riches, others still of simply following their general to the ends of the earth. Caesar often visited these camps, on horseback or on foot, walking among the tents. The soldiers greeted him with joyful shouts, offering bread or wine. He always accepted, sat with them, laughed at their jests. Then, with a word, a glance, he reignited their fervor. In their eyes shone a certainty. Caesar was not a distant commander, but their true leader, bound to them by a sacred oath. Yet despite the glory, despite the fervor, a quiet unease gnawed at him. He knew a triumphal return could prelude a civil war. His enemies would not welcome him as a hero, but as a rival to be crushed. Rome, the city he had served, might be set ablaze by his fault, or rather, by his destiny. One evening, in his tent near the Rubicon, he took a wax tablet and scratched a few words. He weighed his choices, balancing duty against ambition. The lamp's flame cast his shadow immense on the canvas. He understood the hour was approaching when he must decide, lay down his command and risk ruin, or cross the sacred boundary and plunge Rome into turmoil. In the silence of the night, he murmured to himself, "Rome shaped me. Rome sent me beyond the seas. Rome gave me its legions. Rome now must belong to me." Thus, crowned with his Gallic victories, Caesar returned toward Rome, but behind the people's cheers and his soldiers' songs, the shadow of a yet more terrible war loomed. History recorded his triumphs, but already, in the cold marble of the Senate, the struggle that would decide the Republic's fate was being prepared. Chapter 4. The War of Brothers. Part 1. The Rubicon. Winter cloaked Italy, cold and silent, as if the gods held their breath. Caesar had stationed his legions in the north, near the sacred boundary separating his legal command from the heart of the Republic. Before him flowed a small river, insignificant in width, but immense in its forbidden weight, the Rubicon. Beyond this stream, he was no longer proconsul, but a rebel. One step further, and he defied Rome itself. His enemies in the Senate had maneuvered skillfully. Pompey, once his ally, had sided with them. Crassus was dead, and with him collapsed the fragile balance of the triumvirate. Now 2 giants faced each other. Pompey held official authority and part of the legion stationed in Italy and the East. Caesar returned from Gaul with battle-hardened armies, loyal soldiers, and dazzling victories. But if he crossed the Rubicon, he would forever break the pact of laws and customs. He would no longer be a Roman magistrate, but a usurper. In his tent, he spent long hours reflecting. The lamp's flame flickered, casting his shadow immense on the canvas. His officers awaited his orders, torn between impatience and fear. Messengers arrived daily from Rome with alarming news. The Senate accused him of treason. Pompey was hastily recruiting troops. Aristocrats fled southward. Italy braced for the storm. One evening, Caesar summoned his generals. Around the table, their faces were grave, etched by years of campaigns. He unrolled a map of Italy, placing his finger on the blue line winding through the hills. "Here is the Rubicon," he said in a low voice. "If I cross it, we march on Rome. If I stay here, my enemies will strip me of everything, my command, my triumphs, my life." Silence weighed heavy. One lieutenant dared murmur, "General, crossing this boundary means setting Rome ablaze." Caesar fixed his gaze on him. "And not crossing it means delivering Rome to those who tremble before the future." The night advanced. The wind whistled against the canvas, rain beat the camp's cobblestones. Caesar stepped out alone, walking to the river's edge. The black water flowed indifferent, reflecting heavy clouds. He stood still, staring at the current. His thoughts swirled. His mother Aurelia, his first forum speeches, the flames of Alesia, Pompey's face, once a companion, now an enemy, all converged in this fleeting moment where a single step could change history. He raised his eyes to the sky. The moon pierced through clouds, casting cold light on the river's surface. A memory surged. The dream of his youth, a marble-paved road with a laurel crown shining at its end while shadows hindered him. Was this, then, where that vision was fulfilled? Destiny pressed him like an invisible hand. Behind him, a few officers had followed at a distance, holding their breath. Caesar turned, and his voice rang out in the night. "The die is cast." Then he crossed the Rubicon. His horse's steps splashed dark water. The troops following him, hesitant at first, then surged forward as one. The standards crossed the current, Roman eagles reflecting in the rippling water. It was a simple, almost silent moment, yet charged with a power that would echo through the centuries. The Republic had just tipped into civil war. As the cohorts crossed the river, a murmur spread through the ranks. Some prayed to the gods, others smiled with pride. All knew they had embarked on a march from which there was no return. Caesar, on horseback, observed them, his face impassive. But deep within, he felt the ardent flame of certainty. This choice, terrible and grand, was his destiny's. In the days that followed, Italy trembled under his troops' advance. In the cities he passed, some opened their gates acclaiming his name, others fled in panic. Pompey, caught off guard, retreated south, taking with him the senators who supported him. The Republic split in two, like a statue cracked at its core. Caesar advanced cautiously but never slowed. He avoided pillage, protected inhabitants, strove to show his fight was not against Rome, but for Rome. His discipline impressed cities, which surrendered without resistance. Each bloodless victory bolstered his prestige. He seemed to march not as a rebel, but as a liberator. Yet each night, under his tense canvas, he knew the coming war would be long and bloody. Pompey would not flee forever. Behind him stood entire provinces, fleets, wealthy allies. The clash was inevitable. But Caesar, strong with his Gallic legions, his men's loyalty, and the people's fervor, advanced without trembling. The Rubicon was no longer behind him. The river now flowed as an invisible frontier, separating past from future. Before, he was a victorious general, an ambitious man among others. After, he became the man who dared defy the Senate, break the law, and plunge Rome into the storm. One evening, as the legions camped near Ariminum, Caesar gathered his soldiers. Around the fires, weary faces glowed in the flickering light. His voice rose, deep and soothing. "Companions, we have crossed the river none were to cross. We have chosen the path of courage. This path will be long, it will be hard, but it leads to glory. Know this, I will never abandon you. You are my brothers, and together we will go to the end." A silence followed. Then an immense clamor erupted like thunder rolling through the night. The legions had accepted their destiny. Thus began the War of Brothers. Rome, torn apart, was about to blaze. But at the heart of this storm, Caesar marched with the certainty of one who had looked the gods in the eye and chosen not to retreat. Part 2. Caesar against Pompey. Once the Rubicon was crossed, the war took the form of a vast game of shadows, where every flame lit in Italy cast others on distant shores. Pompey refused direct confrontation. He evacuated Rome, retreated to Brundisium, embarked with the frightened Senate, and sailed to Epirus, escorted by the winter sea and confidence in his fleet, eastern granaries, and the authority of the law. Caesar, left on the wind-swept quay, watched the last sails vanish. A sailor, face lashed by spray, dared say, "They flee, but they'll return with the world." Caesar replied softly, "Then we'll take that world before them." He did not head straight to Greece. With cold calculation, he turned his sandals westward, crossed passes, forded rivers swollen by the thaw, and descended on Pompey's Spain like a silent falcon. At Ilerda, above the muddy waters of the Segre, he encircled, cut off supplies, dug trenches, repositioned camps like pieces on an ebony board. Rain flooded ditches, clay swallowed soldiers' boots, but each dawn found him standing, cloak tight, voice firm. Pompey's lieutenants surrendered. "I often fight," he told his centurions, "but I prefer to conquer by hunger. Hunger buries fewer fathers." Only then did he turn toward the Adriatic. The sea gleamed with steel-like cold, cut by the dark silhouettes of enemy ships. At night, under a sky where icy breath carried the scent of salt and seaweed, he embarked chosen cohorts, slipping from island to island, using mist like a cloak. Rowers held their breath. Only the steady splash of oars was heard. "How far?" whispered a tribune. "To the end of fear," Caesar replied. When at dawn Epirus's coast appeared, gray and bare, Roman standards rose like flames. The duel could begin. At Dyrrhachium first, Pompey dealt him a stinging blow. Caesar, too bold, tried to encircle the port with a line of earthworks stretching for miles. He raised towers, planted stakes, dug ditches where brackish water lapped. But the sun and stone were not with him. Pompey's sudden attack breached a weak point, and for the first time Caesar's cohorts wavered like banners in a squall. The sand was strewn with men retreating, teeth clenched. Caesar rushed forward, seized an eagle with his hands, and, turning to the fleeing, "Will you deliver your general to the enemy?" Shame proved a stronger barrier than palisades. The line reformed. Pompey did not pursue. That night, in his tent, Caesar lay long with eyes open. Failure was not an end, only an angle to adjust. Now they hunted each other. 2 veterans, 2 schools. Pompey, rich in men and grain, stretched his camp like a net, content to wear down his foe. Caesar, poor in all but speed, struck, feinted, cut, halted to force the clash. Between them, Greece trembled like a harp in a summer wind, valleys, white paths, ancient olives, the scent of dry grass and hot dust. Destiny led them to the plain of Pharsalus. At dawn, low light stretched the shadows of stakes, shards clinked underfoot, and thin columns of smoke rose from barley fires. Caesar deployed his cohorts, 3 lines, little cavalry, but a corps of veterans who could count a clash's seconds like heartbeats. Opposite, Pompey offered the magnificence of an army confident in its numbers. Heavy cavalry on his left wing, thick infantry, archers in clusters, dust already rising under hooves. Caesar rode along his front calm, a hand on his sword's hilt. "Today," he said, "we fight citizens, not barbarians. Let your blows be sure, not cruel. Let the empire rise from order, not rage." He paused his horse, then to his officers, "The enemy's left wing is their pride. Let it become their fall." He pulled 6 cohorts from his 3rd line and placed them at an angle behind his meager cavalry, almost hidden, like a claw beneath a cloak. "When their cavalry charges, aim for their faces," he whispered to these chosen men. "Make them close their eyes." Silence fell, vast, then shattered with the first cry. Trumpets screamed, standards dipped, and the ground vibrated like a drum. Roman javelins arched through the air, landing with a wet thud. Dust rose heavy, hot, laced with the metallic scent of blood. Visibility shrank to 2 spear lengths. Men fought by instinct, guided by a centurion's voice rising like a beacon. On Pompey's left, the splendid cavalry charged, plumed helmets, polished cuirasses, a torrent of brute force. Caesar's small cavalry bent, withdrew deliberately, luring the tide into the trap. Then the 6 cohorts rose like a hedge of thorns. Shields clashed, javelins flew, then short blades flashed, aimed straight at faces. It is said even the bravest hesitate before a point seeking the light of their gaze. The charge broke, wavered, fell back. Caesar seized the moment. "Advance!" The 3rd line, until then statue still, became a torrent. It smashed the infantry before it, while Pompey's wing, stripped of cover, twisted like a torn sail. Lost calls, orders that never reached, and the rumble of thousands of steps retreating on bare stone. Pompey, stunned by a reserve he hadn't anticipated, froze a beat too long. The battle was already slipping away. The dust parted for a moment, and Caesar glimpsed his foe, still noble, pale under his helmet. A thought without venom crossed his mind. Once they had dreamed together of ruling the city. He lowered his hand, and his line pushed like a moving plinth. Pompey's center buckled, cracked, broke. Eagles fell into dry grass. Men, kneeling, stretched out pleading hands. Caesar's veterans, panting, knew not to cry victory too soon. They closed the jaw methodically, cohort by cohort, until the plain exhaled a long moan and fell silent. Evening took on the color of ashes. Among makeshift tents, moans, whispers, the clink of a set-down cup were heard. Caesar walked slowly among the wounded, eyes lowered. "To the living, clemency," he said. Some captives wept, others dazed, stared at a sky where a lone star had flared. It seemed to laugh with cold light. Pompey had fled. To the sea, to Egypt, to destiny's final detour. Caesar bent over a crumpled map, traced the sea route with his finger. He knew what it meant. Nothing was over. But that day, the Republic had chosen its master, not by vote, but by the silent alignment of the dead and the exhaustion of the living. "We fought not to hate," he told a tribune. "Tomorrow we command to rebuild." At night, he stepped out alone. The plain of Pharsalus exhaled scents of grass, dust, and iron. He raised his head. The constellation still seemed to form the laurel crown of his childhood dreams. Yet at its edge a shadow lingered. The gods, perhaps, reminded that each victory carves a price into the victor's flesh. Caesar sighed, returned under the canvas, and, before closing his eyes, murmured to himself, "Rome, I come." Part 3. Alexandria and Cleopatra. After Pharsalus, the plain's dust settled, heavy with blood and silence. Pompey, defeated, was but a shadow of himself. He had fled the battlefield in haste, crossed seas and shores, reaching Egypt in hope of refuge. But kings rarely shelter losers. Young Ptolemy III, guided by his regents and fearing to offend Caesar, thought to please by delivering the former hero's head. On a wind-swept beach, Pompey was murdered, stabbed before he could speak. It is said his eyes, in their final moment, rose to the sea as if seeking lost greatness. When Caesar arrived soon after, the sand still bore traces of the crime. The Egyptians presented him the embalmed head, thinking to honor him. But Caesar turned away. He wept, it is said, at the sight of that extinguished face. "To a great man," he said, "a nobler end was due." With these words, he reminded all that Pompey was not just a rival, but a former comrade, a Roman, a brother. In his heart, the civil war had crossed an irreversible threshold. He was now the last giant standing, but Alexandria, city of pharaohs and Ptolemies, was no haven of peace. The capital buzzed with plots and factions. Two heirs vied for the throne: Ptolemy III, a child manipulated by his advisors, and his sister Cleopatra, exiled, but determined to reclaim her crown. Caesar, landing, found himself plunged into this dynastic quarrel. Egypt, Rome's granary, could not be left to chaos. Cleopatra, barely 20, seized her chance. Legend tells she had herself smuggled into the palace where Caesar resided, rolled in a carpet her servants laid at his feet. When the fabric unfurled, a graceful figure appeared, eyes gleaming with defiance and seduction. Caesar, surprised, gazed at her long. In this bold apparition, he saw not only a woman, but a queen, born to rule. Their alliance was born instantly, both political and sensual. Cleopatra spoke with rare assurance, her words blending softness and firmness. She described her kingdom as a sacred land, heir to pharaohs and gods, yet threatened by intrigue and civil war. Caesar listened, enthralled. She had the radiance of a goddess, but also a strategist's cunning. Together, they traced the lines of a new destiny. Ptolemy's partisans did not accept it. Soon, Alexandria blazed. Entire streets became battlegrounds. Stones flew from rooftops. Arrows whistled through the burning air. Caesar and his small force found themselves besieged in the palace quarter. The port burned. The sea reflected the fire's red glow. The Egyptians, countless, pressed the Romans from all sides. But Caesar, true to himself, turned the siege into a lesson in discipline. He fortified approaches, organized defenses, repelled each assault with tireless energy. His soldiers, despite overwhelming odds, held their ground. Flames devoured warehouses. Assailants' cries echoed in the night. But Caesar walked the ramparts, cloak billowing, his voice carrying beyond the tumult. "Rome is with us," he repeated, "and Rome does not fall behind walls." One episode marked those fiery days. The great lighthouse of Alexandria, a wonder of the world, nearly fell in the fighting. Caesar, seeing the danger, personally led a daring expedition to retake it. He was seen, amid his men, swimming through waves to escape an enemy assault, holding campaign tablets above the water. This gesture, recounted and embellished by his soldiers, became legend, the general who braved the sea rather than abandon his plans. Gradually, the tide turned. Reinforcements from Syria, loyal to Rome, landed on the coasts. Ptolemy's forces were defeated in a great battle by the Nile. The young king, fleeing on a skiff, met death in the murky waters. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Egypt, now ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, but, in truth, the absolute mistress of the throne. In the now peaceful palace, Caesar and Cleopatra spent long hours conversing. She showed him the pharaoh's treasures, temples with countless columns, the mysteries of ancient gods. He spoke of Rome, its wars, his dream of unity and power. Two worlds met, east and west, in an embrace both political and intimate. Cleopatra soon bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, whom some already hailed as the heir to a new dynasty. Yet Caesar knew he could not linger forever by the Nile. Rome awaited, and Rome rumbled. Not all his enemies were vanquished. Already in the distance, the last Pompeian holdouts prepared to reignite the war. But leaving Alexandria, he carried more than a memory. He had sealed an alliance with one of history's most fascinating queens, and his glory took on the mysterious sheen of Egypt. The night before his departure, he stood alone on the palace terrace. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and flowers. Before him, the lighthouse of Alexandria cast its light into the darkness like an arm reaching toward infinity. Caesar thought of Pompey, whose body rested somewhere in these same sands. He thought of Cleopatra, asleep in the royal chambers, and of the child who would bear his name. Above all, he thought of Rome, where both crown and dagger awaited. "The gods lead me," he murmured, "but to what end?" As dawn pinked the horizon, he ordered the march. His standards rose, his ships glided over the gleaming sea. Behind him, Alexandria awoke under a golden sun, silent guardian of a love and alliance that would haunt the centuries. Ahead, Rome opened, vast and menacing, ready to welcome its master returned from Egypt's sands. Chapter 5. The Dictator for Life. Part 1. Reforms and Grandeur. Rome awaited him with immense thirst. Years of civil war had left the city weary, exhausted. trembling before the future. When Caesar returned from the east, crowned with victory and cloaked in Egypt's mysterious allure, he was greeted by frenzied crowds, the streets filled with shouts, flowers thrown at his passage, songs chanted by children. Victorious standards rose in the clear air, and drums echoed like destiny's heartbeat. The Senate, compelled, had no choice but to name him dictator. This title, once temporary and tied to crises, became for him a prolonged charge, then a lifelong mandate. It was no longer the shadow of emergency power, it was absolute authority, concentrated in one man's hands. Some saw tyranny, others the salvation of a republic weary of its divisions. Caesar took this charge not as a power-hungry tyrant, but as a builder. He looked at Rome, the ancient city with blackened temples, narrow alleys, outdated laws, and sought to transform it. Each day, surrounded by scribes and silent senators, he dictated reforms. He reorganized the calendar, establishing what would bear his name, the Julian calendar. The seasons finally found their order, festivals reclaimed their rightful place, and farmers could sow without fear of error. It seemed a simple act, but its scope was immense. Time itself, that elusive river, had just received a dam forged by his will. He also reformed the Senate, expanding its ranks to include men from the provinces. This move irritated old families, who saw their prestige diluted, but it brought the breath of an expanding empire into the halls of power. Now Spain, Gaul, Africa, and the East had voices in the great assembly. Rome was no longer a city ruling peoples. It was becoming the center of a shared world. Caesar also thought of the people, the crowds he had known how to charm since youth. He eased their debts, distributed lands to veterans, built new forums, temples, basilicas. Hewn stones rang under hammers, and workers' silhouettes stood out in the sun. The city, once choked with misery and ruins, was covered in edifices bearing his mark. Each reform struck a blow at the old aristocracy, but each was also a promise to the people. In markets, theaters, taverns, they whispered, "Caesar thinks of us." In the countryside, veterans plowed their new lands, thanking the gods for a leader who kept his word. Yet Caesar was not content to be an administrator. His grandeur lay in his vision of the world. He dreamed of a unified Rome, an empire where provinces were no longer conquered territories but integrated parts, bound to the city by rights and duties. He sent colonists to found cities, reorganized roads, restored finances, even planned a future campaign against the Parthians to avenge Crassus and extend the borders further. Each evening, in his forum residence, he received poets, scholars, architects. He spoke of the future, sketching plans for libraries, canals, new laws. His voice resonated with quiet conviction. Rome is too great to remain a fragile republic. Rome must become the empire of the world. His listeners, captivated, drank his words like one gazes at a star too bright to hold long. But this grandeur also cast shadows. In the Senate, some whispered he was making himself king. It was reported that one day, in the Forum, Mark Antony tried to offer him a crown. Caesar refused, pushing it away with calculated theatricality. The crowd cheered, but senators saw in this ostentatious refusal another provocation. Was it a performance, a prelude to future acceptance? Mistrust grew. Cato was gone, but his spiritual heirs continued the fight, Brutus, Cassius, and other senators watched with alarm the man reshaping Rome to his will. They saw the old republican liberty vanish day by day, replaced by one man's hand. Caesar did not hide. He loved appearing in purple, having his image struck on coins, being acclaimed as a demigod. To the people, these acts were just honors for a hero. To the aristocracy, they were signs of a disguised monarchy. In the temples, augurs reported troubling omens. Lightning struck in clear skies, statues mysteriously wept. Birds fell dead before sanctuaries. The superstitious saw these as portents of tragedy. One evening, Caesar walked alone on the Capitoline. The wind lifted his toga, and the guards' torches cast flickering light on the columns. He gazed at the sleeping city, the clustered roofs, gleaming temples, streets reviving after so many wars. Rome, pacified, reborn, shone before his eyes. But in that silence, a thought cut through him like a blade. The same city that acclaimed him could tomorrow betray him. He placed his hand on a cold column and murmured, "Have I built an empire or forged my own tomb?" No answer came. But in the distance, beyond the hills, the wind carried a dark breath, that of men already plotting in the shadows. For now, Caesar shone. He was Rome's master, the reformer, the builder, the visionary. But behind the cheers, the Republic was dying, and the knives were already being prepared. Part 2. Crown and Conspiracy. Rome bathed in radiant light, but shadows grew in hearts. Caesar, absolute master, seemed untouchable. His statues adorned the squares. His face was etched on coins. His glory filled the people's songs. But the higher his name rose, the more some senators felt the weight of a yoke they refused. Old families, proud of their republican heritage, whispered among themselves that Rome had driven out its kings only to see one reborn in more flamboyant guise. One episode caused a stir. It was during the Lupercalia, an ancient festival where priests ran through the streets, striking passers-by with leather strips to ensure fertility and prosperity. The crowd, massed around the forum, buzzed with fervent enthusiasm. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, held a laurel crown. He approached his leader and, with theatrical flourish, offered it to him. Silence fell like a veil. Thousands of eyes watched the moment. Caesar pushed the crown away. A thunder of cheers erupted, the crowd shouting his name, praising his modesty. But Antony insisted, presenting it a second time. Caesar refused again, more sharply, as if the gesture offended him. The clamor grew even louder. The crown was placed in a temple, and the people celebrated the greatness of a man who rejected kingship. But in the shadowy columns of the Senate, murmurs took a different tone. Some said it was all a charade, that Caesar had orchestrated the scene to taste the crown's allure twice without yet accepting it. They saw in him not a republican, but a king in disguise, awaiting the opportune moment. The omens, too, seemed to multiply. One evening, birds fell dead on the steps of the Capitoline. Slaves swore they saw invisible torches burning in the sky. A statue of Caesar, struck by lightning, was found split in two. The augurs consulted spoke of broken balances, of anxious gods. The people shuddered, but continued to acclaim him. The senators, however, read in these signs the announcement of a destiny that must be diverted by human hands. Brutus, Marcus Junius Brutus, was at the center of these murmurs. Caesar's adopted son, by affection, protected, honored. He was also the descendant of the illustrious Brutus, who had once driven out Rome's last king. His name alone evoked the defense of the Republic. Caesar, it is said, loved him like a son. But Brutus, torn between gratitude and the legacy of his blood, was slowly drawn to the conspirators. Cassius, a dark and passionate spirit, knew how to fan the embers of revolt in his heart. "Do you believe," he said, "that Caesar will always refuse the crown? Do you think he does not dream in secret of sitting on a golden throne? If you love him, save him from himself. If you love Rome, save her from him." The meetings were held in secret, in dim houses, in gardens where the shadows of cypresses hid their words. Each night the conspirators swore on their daggers that Caesar must not live longer. Their numbers grew. Frustrated senators, disappointed ambitious men, partisans of the old liberty. They spoke of a decisive blow, of a single morning that would change everything. Meanwhile, Caesar continued to act as if no danger surrounded him. He multiplied reforms, prepared an expedition against the Parthians, spoke of waging war beyond the known borders. His mind already saw beyond Rome, but his nights were troubled. Calpurnia, his wife, had dark dreams. She begged him to be wary, to avoid going out on certain days. She had seen in a dream their house collapsing, her husband bloodied, the people crying in the streets. Caesar, moved, tried to reassure her. Dreams frighten those who doubt, but I am certain of my path. Yet at times a veil passed over his gaze, as when he crossed the forum and amid the din of cheers thought he heard a deeper, colder murmur, that of blades still invisible. The eve of the Ides of March, the omens grew more insistent. The soothsayers consulted, advised him not to go out. One of them, Spurina, told him to his face, "Caesar, beware the Ides of March." Caesar smiled, a little ironic, but inwardly troubled. That evening, Calpurnia renewed her pleas. She fell to her knees, begging him to stay home, not to go to the Senate. Caesar hesitated. All his life he had defied gods and men, but that evening he thought that prudence might be wisdom. He announced he would not go out. But in the morning, Decimus Brutus, one of his close allies, came to him and persuaded him. "The senators await you," he said. "They will see in your absence a slight, an insult. Come, show yourself. You are Caesar. No omen can stop you." Caesar, flattered and swayed, finally yielded. He draped himself in his toga, took his place in the litter that would carry him to the Senate. The streets buzzed with a strange agitation, mingling enthusiasm and tension. Some greeted him with fervor, others turned their eyes away. The temples seemed darker than usual, the columns loomed like threats. Yet Caesar advanced, serene, as if all were but the continuation of his destiny. In his mind echoed the soothsayer's words, "Beware the Ides of March." But he shook his head and said to those accompanying him, "The Ides have come." As if to ward off fate, he added with a smile, "But they have not yet passed." He did not know that behind the Senate's walls the conspirators were sharpening their daggers, ready to write in blood the end of one world and the beginning of another. Part 3. The Ides of March. The morning opened on a pale sky, veiled with mist. Rome awoke slowly, artisans pulling back shutters, children running through damp alleys, temples releasing the first wisps of sacrificial smoke. But that day, the Ides of March, the air seemed heavier, as if an invisible silence weighed on the rooftops. The gods held their breath. In his forum residence, Caesar dressed with unusual slowness. His toga, adjusted over his shoulders, fell with majesty. His servants whispered, troubled by the grave air surrounding him. Calpurnia, pale, renewed her pleas. She recounted new dreams. Their house collapsed. Caesar lying bloodied, the people in tears. She threw herself at his feet, begging him not to go out. Caesar, moved by such fear, considered listening to her for a moment. He ordered that the senators be informed he would not come. But soon Decimus Brutus, complicit in the plot, entered. With honeyed words, he urged him. "The Republic awaits you," he said. "If you stay home, the senators will think you despise them. Show yourself, Caesar. Prove that omens do not frighten you." Caesar hesitated again, then yielded. He rose, draped in purple, and was carried to the Senate. The litter crossed Rome's streets. The crowd pressed close, greeting the dictator with cheers. Some faces radiated admiration, others turned away, somber. The Capitoline's colonnades rose, imposing, and the air seemed to vibrate with a muted tension. Priests at temple doors watched his passage with unease, as if they too knew history was moving toward a tear. Arriving at the Curia of Pompey, Caesar stepped down from his litter. The building, simple and solemn, bore the name of the man he had defeated, like an ironic omen. Senators awaited him at the entrance, their faces grave, their eyes barely concealing inner agitation. He climbed the steps with a firm stride. At that moment, a passerby dared murmur, "Caesar, beware the Ides of March." He turned, gave a faint smile. "They have come." Then he entered. The hall was filled. The stone benches, sober columns, light filtering through openings, gave the assembly a temple-like air. Caesar advanced toward his seat, surrounded by senators who bowed with forced deference. The conspirators had scattered among them, concealing daggers under their togas. Brutus, Cassius, Casca, Decimus, and others, some 30 in all, stood ready, hearts pounding. Caesar sat. He began listening to the first words spoken, his mind already turned to the projects he was preparing, new laws, future campaigns, empire reorganization. He did not notice at first the glances exchanged around him. Then suddenly Casca approached, a document in hand, pretending to present a petition. When Caesar refused, the man drew his dagger and struck. The blade grazed the toga, causing only a superficial wound. Caesar, startled, leapt up and cried, "Casca, wretch, what are you doing?" But already the others rushed forward. Daggers flashed from all sides, gleaming in the pale light. Caesar tried to defend himself, seizing an assailant's arm, retreating toward his seat. His cries echoed, his stature still commanding, but their numbers overwhelmed him. The blows rained down, each conspirator seeking to drive in his blade to share in the glory of the murder. Then, among them, he saw Brutus. His Brutus, the friend, the adopted son of his affection, the one in whom he had placed his trust. Their eyes met. Caesar, struck in the side, staggered. In his gaze passed a pain greater than all his wounds. "You too, Brutus," he murmured, his voice broken. It was less a reproach than a realization, the sign that even love had yielded before the Republic. He ceased resisting. His body, pierced by 23 blows, sank slowly. His toga stained red. He wrapped its fold over his face and collapsed at the foot of Pompey's statue. Thus ended the destiny of the man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, triumphed at Pharsalus, subdued Egypt, and dominated Rome. Silence fell in the Curia. The conspirators' short breaths echoed, mingled with the rapid beating of their hearts. Then one of them cried, "Thus die tyrants!" The others repeated, their trembling voices striving to be firm. But outside, the people still did not know their hero lay inside, bathed in blood. When the news spread, all of Rome was shaken. Some celebrated the return of liberty, but most, stunned, covered themselves in mourning. The streets buzzed with lamentations. Citizens recalled the bread distributed, the lands given, the festivals, the victories. To them, Caesar was not a tyrant, but a father. The Senate, believing it had restored the Republic, had in fact ended it. Mark Antony, loyal lieutenant, organized the funeral. Caesar's body was displayed in the Forum, and the crowd thronged by the thousands. When Antony spoke, his voice trembled with contained anger. He showed the wounds, named the conspirators, recalled all Caesar had done for the people. Anger stirred in hearts. Flames were lit, makeshift pyres raised, and the city erupted in immense tumult. Thus, the Ides of March, meant to save the Republic, instead opened the path to the empire. In Caesar's blood, a new world was born. His heirs, his partisans, his spiritual son Octavian would carry on his dream. His name, far from fading, became a legend, and in the silence of the night that followed, as the consumed body rested in ashes, Rome understood that a man had just transcended mortal measure. Julius Caesar, the dictator, the conqueror, the visionary, had died. But Caesar, the myth, was born, eternal, etched forever in history's marble. Julius Caesar remains one of history's most radiant and enigmatic figures. His enemies accused him of boundless ambition. His supporters celebrated him as the father of an empire. He was both a man of iron and a man of charm, an implacable strategist and a seductive orator, a daring general and a visionary administrator. He possessed the rare ability to be close to the humble while rising above kings. In the camps, he shared the soldiers' bread and knew their names. In the temples, he reformed laws and organized time itself through his calendar. He wielded with equal dexterity the sword and the word, the blade and the verb. His conquests in Gaul revealed a military genius blending speed, discipline, and audacity. At Alesia, he made earth and wood a living fortress. At Pharsalus, he devised maneuvers that toppled Pompey's cavalry. His vision went beyond battle. He dreamed of a unified world where Rome would no longer be a city, but an endless empire. His character, fueled by tireless energy and ardent ambition, led him to cross the Rubicon, defying law to seize destiny. He was lenient toward his enemies, generous to the people, but inflexible against those who opposed his dream. His conquests, reforms, and even his seduction of figures like Cleopatra painted a portrait both grandiose and human. He fell, struck by those who claimed to defend liberty, but his death only sealed his immortality. For Caesar was not merely a man, he was an era, a transition between a faltering republic and an empire yet to be born. And even today, his name resonates like a title: Caesar, Kaiser, Tsar. So many crowns forged in the echo of his destiny. Ambitious, visionary, conqueror, builder, he was all these at once, and his shadow, vaster than empires, continues to loom over the world of men. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.